So I've learned a ton. As Rick said, I helped start the 180 initiative on chronic and veteran homelessness in Santa Cruz County, and that was thrilling to me. I didn't have expertise in homelessness, but what I had was some business experience and finance experience and thinking about how systems could work together. And so I teamed up with the actual experts on homelessness, and we were able to create a lot of change, policy change, systems change, cooperation among local government agencies here and nonprofits that weren't working together before. And this was not invented here. This is things that were being done across the nation. But we learned from the best efforts out there in cities in California and across the country, and tried to implement everything we could here. And it was highly successful in a lot of ways, in that we went from very few individuals who are chronically homeless successfully getting into permanent housing in our county, to getting to about 12 folks who are chronically homeless getting housing every month. And sustaining that level and improving upon it. And that was very exciting, especially for a while. And with each individual, it is very exciting. It's very exciting today. And I've seen so many lives turn around, and realized that as a non-professional service provider, you can't predict from the behaviors you see out on the street that are obviously very challenging. You can't predict how much an individual can turn around with housing and supportive services. And that it's just been mind-blowing to me. And that initiative started at the beginning of 2012, has now helped countywide, with many service providers cooperating, over 800 individuals who've been chronically homeless in our community, on average for at least 8 years on the streets in Santa Cruz County, into permanent housing, with a very high success rate of sustaining housing long term. So that's very exciting. Unfortunately, when we started for years looking at that, and saying, well, the next goal is not just how many folks can we house, but how can we end chronic and veteran homelessness in our community? And we were not making as much progress on that because of more people becoming homeless, and our ability to accelerate, help more folks out of long-term homelessness was really ran into the challenges of just not having enough housing to find anywhere. Even when we have a voucher or something, we can't, even we could find a way to pay for it and to pay for services, supportive services, substance abuse treatment, etc., we could not find actual housing unit. And then, of course, as I dove into that, we're like, how can we just create some permanent supportive housing, create a little bit, buy some, build some, anything? Especially there are individuals in that population who really need a lot of supportive services. So how can we have some housing that specialty housing for that? Really realized, I mean, the housing crisis has just this decade gotten so broad in California, and it was very hard to even employ staff who are trained to help folks who are homeless and to live in this area. And so I really decided 5 years ago I needed to dive full-time into becoming a developer to try to create housing that our community really needs, not only around homelessness, but around all the folks working and living in our community struggling to afford housing here. So that was my initial impetus, and I really decided to commit to that long term when I realized that even with all the challenges we face in California and how we've made it extremely expensive and risky to build almost anything, we actually can build rental housing and have it work out financially in the long run. We just typically don't do it because we're not building all that much housing to begin with. And so when we do, and because of that risk in particular, we tend to build more expensive for sale housing and meet that part of the market, and build very little rental housing. So I wanted to see how could we build a lot more rental housing. And some of the things I've learned is I would characterize our housing challenge nationally, really, as important to look at in three separate ways, like three big challenges. One is sort of what I started from, which is that there are folks in our society who are struggling to be able to afford any housing. no matter what. And not just here in California where housing is expensive, but anywhere in the country. That is true. And yes, there are folks who are homeless, folks with some disabilities, reentry from prison system, you know, a variety of, and just people in unfortunate circumstances, whether it's choice or just poor circumstances. There's going to be folks extremely low income level or very low income level that very hard to afford any housing, even in a well-functioning market. And so that's, I mean, that's the reason we have subsidy vouchers, whether for veterans or low-income families, for example. And we need other, and that's a reason that affordable housing with public dollars starts getting created, to have this permanent supportive housing, to have housing that people can live in for a while as they move forward economically. So that's important to have, and that's one category. The other category that we have now in California is just a much wider income range that still can't afford housing. And so we, you know, love using the teacher example because everybody understands we need public school teachers, and public school teachers can't afford housing. You can't have a community. But that's symbolic of so many other folks. And so we've created in California such a housing shortage that this inability to afford housing is much, much wider than just extremely low income or certain circumstances. So when you're thinking about solutions, that's a somewhat separate problem. And then I would put thirdly, overlaying those two problems is racial equity problem, where we have, you know, hundreds of years, but decades, and in certain ways continue to have discrimination in housing policies and or effects from extreme discrimination that existed in housing for so long. And so I think any solutions also have to be looked at in that lens. So one of the things then within those, keeping in mind those three elements of a huge housing crisis, is that in that middle element I talked about, where a very wide economic set of folks are struggling to afford any housing in California, is just realizing how big and fundamental the problem is. And that's really well understood, that you know, the 2016 numbers that we would need more than 2 million more units of housing in 2016 in California. 2 million units. I mean, that's huge. That's whole big cities that we don't have, in order to have that amount of housing per capita that the rest of the United States has. So that at a top line, that's why housing in California is expensive. Now, there's a lot of reasons why behind that, but at a top line, that's why it's expensive, is that we just don't have enough for the number of people who are here. And we haven't been growing rapidly. California is growing in population bit by bit. I would not characterize it in very recent decades as rapid growth. We just build very, very little housing compared to our population, compared to modest population growth. So we're 2 million units behind. And so it's musical chairs and it's an auction for most housing, right? So no surprise that price goes up and up when we also have industries with high salaries. We're good at creating some high salary jobs. Well, that's who's going to win the auction, right? So price is going to keep going up. So, and a mind-blowing statistic, there's so many coping mechanisms with this incredible housing shortage, besides homelessness, which is not a coping mechanism, but as a result, but there's so many coping mechanisms that now adults age 18 to 34, wide range, 18 to 34 in California, 40% of all adults in that age range live with their parents. And so some of those folks are married and living with, you know, one of their parents. So we have all this way, we've doubled and tripled up. Household size for the first time in hundreds of years now in the United States, even as a whole, but California much more so, is now growing. And that's, again, not because people are having more children, but because people are doubling and tripling up. So a lot of coping mechanisms like that are hiding even some of the extent of that housing shortage. So And then what's important to understand is the increment is that each year we would need estimated about 180,000 units of new housing in California to keep up with the gradual increase in demand. So we're close to 40 million people or whatever. We're growing by less than 1% per year, but it would take 180,000 units of housing. We haven't created 180,000 units of new housing in California in decades in a single year. We're building less than half of that. And so each year we're adding to our deficit. Even though you look, I mean, some people look around in California and say, wow, there's a lot of construction. Well, because we had so little during the Great Recession, and there's certain pockets in downtown Oakland, there's a lot of cranes and stuff. But statewide, the numbers are still there. This year we're actually down in number of new homes coming online. It's been up to even 120,000 new units of housing the last couple years, but this year it's looking at under 100,000. So we're adding to that deficit every single year. The housing crisis in terms of open market affordability is getting worse every year, and we have not turned that around. So when you heard Governor Newsom on the campaign trail saying we want to try to build 3.5 million units of housing by 2025, I think everybody looking at this problem says, okay, that is not going to happen, but it's great to have ambitious goals. And so he was advocating for that ambitious goal. That number, he didn't make it up as a nice round number. It's that 2 million deficit in 2016 plus the additional deficit we keep adding to every year. So by 2025, from last year through 2025, if we built 3.5 million units of new housing in California, which you're not going to do, but if we actually succeed in doing that, we would have solved that per capita housing problem. So we would have, and that solves that one of those three problems I talked about. The fact that a lot of folks, households who have a reasonable amount of income, solid jobs, can't afford housing. That would solve that by just having amount of housing per capita. It wouldn't necessarily solve the other two problems, but it would solve that one. So that's where those numbers come from, but again, we're falling behind every year. And so to put that in a little bit of a local perspective, say that share of that overall big deficit we have in a reasonable amount of housing per capita, the share of it locally, maybe within the city of Santa Cruz, might be about 3,000 units of housing that would have to just, if we were there, it had that instantly inside the city of Santa Cruz, and the city of Santa Cruz would have done its share of that overall deficit. If you only have one spot that does that, it's kind of like the induced demand around traffic. You're not going to see that necessarily solve housing affordability. We do see when one spot creates a bunch more housing online, rents stop going up for a while. So you can meet demand by bringing supply online. But what we need is California-wide, all jurisdictions doing a certain share of that, and of course concentrating that around transit and jobs. So it's not that we need to evenly build housing out in unincorporated areas of Santa Cruz County to get the county's share. We need to focus on good planning on where that housing goes. But that gives you, a local number to think about. So that's kind of the bad starting point. And so we're in a rough situation, and we haven't yet turned around this ship. There's some good things happening, and especially at that state level. We dug this hole largely because of this tragedy of the Commons. Both I would say two things. One is by having almost complete local control. There's a lot of great things around local control, around planning, and we're not going to change a lot of those things. And we've done some awesome things with that here locally, like stopping sprawl and protecting greenbelt, protecting ag land. That's fantastic. And we don't want to change those things. But by having absolute local control, then there's a great compelling human reaction some of the time to fear change, not want change. If you like the way things are, keep them that way. Don't do anything that might risk some of the good things we have. And that combined with, who votes, and who's elected and everything, there's a lot of resistance in local governments around, kind of built in and from positive elements of the environmental movement over the last decades to, reduce all development. But what that's meant is this tragedy of the commons, where no one jurisdiction around California wants to be the one to like do a better job of creating more housing, including affordable housing, especially rental housing, etc. So what we have to do to get out of that is statewide change. Now, the state is not going to suddenly take planning control over communities, but the way that is actually happening, this is I think it's going in the right direction. In fits and starts, there's a lot of the state legislature is absolutely working on affordable housing and overall housing supply. And one of the ways it's doing that is just taking down certain barriers, and adding basic requirements to cities. So some of them, SB 330, I'm on the edge of my seat to make sure that the governor signs that here in the next 10 days. But that is one that's been fought about over this idea of local control, but it's saying, again, local planning departments are going to do their job, but they need to be somewhat efficient. They need to get back on a housing project in a reasonable amount of time and tell that project all the ways in which their application for building housing is incomplete. So just some basic things, some flow in the process needs to happen. But it's still, all these things are still local decisions. But the big sea change is on is a way out of this tragedy of the commons on total amount of housing to be created. How many people here could think that they could explain what RHNA goals are? Does anyone? Okay, a couple folks who I know know the answer to that. Okay, this is pretty wonky, but it's a really important thing going on, so I want to try to translate this. For decades now, the state, in a way to try to stop this housing crisis from having gotten to this point, a mechanism the state had is statewide planning, and then it goes down to a regional agency, gives each local government an assignment of an amount of housing to deal with population growth, not the accumulated deficit, but just to try to keep up with projected growth. An assignment of number of units of housing at different income levels. So this is about affordability as well. Very low income, moderate income, and open market, presumed to be, higher income. So these different income levels, and said, okay, you, County of Santa Cruz, unincorporated area, you, Capitola, you, Santa Cruz, you got a plan for that much housing. And saying, well, the local government's function is to do the land use planning. So you have to make sure in your zoning that much housing could theoretically be built. And the idea is then, okay, the market's going to be out there and some subsidy from the government on the very low income, et cetera, and it should get done if it could get the planning's there, and should be able to be taken care of and get done. And it never has. And some of that process was done disingenuously in certain ways by local government. Well, in theory, the numbers were there to satisfy the state. In practice, it was very, very hard to develop some of these parcels. And it also just wasn't enough. I'm not going to go way in the details, but it never worked. Almost nowhere ever meets these are called RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation or Assessment numbers, and no one's ever meeting them. And so, but we've had this process in place, and so, and it does have meaning. And so what the state has passed laws to do is, one, put some teeth in place and say, first of all, there were jurisdictions not even complying with that part and saying, no, you have to comply. And that's where the state has started even suing cities that, after years and years of warnings, never comply. Our local jurisdictions here in this region have been complying with that. But now is saying, look, no, you really got to make sure that housing gets created. So, and if you don't, then in one cycle, maybe you thought you were planning for it, but only half of it got built, given income levels or whatever, then that deficit rolls over into your goal the next time. Makes complete sense. If you're adding to the overall state deficit in housing, and these are in cycles. It's, every 7 or 8 years, the state says, okay, do your next big zoning look at how you're going to create this housing, a plan for the affordable housing, etc. Do it again, turn in the report, get a new target number. So now it's going to accumulate. And that's just this next cycle that's happening that's kicking in. And that's a really big deal, because if we actually are zoning for more housing and more of it, you know, that's one of the barriers, could really get being created. But there's also, the state has some and is looking at more ways to have carrots and sticks to say, look, here's some funding, cities, to do this planning. Plan for denser housing in your downtowns, you know, however you want to do it. And here's some sticks. So there might be even penalties if you're not doing this, or if you're not going to be eligible for state funding if you're not getting this housing created. It's one of the best mechanisms that's going to gradually start changing this. And it is a way to have every community do their fair share. While there's screaming about local control around some of these measures, I really personally advocate for this method, because every community still then has control on how they do it, on where they zone and plan for this housing, on how tall the buildings are, on how much of it is backyard ADUs versus apartment buildings, you know, how it can be clustered around transportation, how it can be planned for the future. So there's incredible local control on how. It's just saying, look, nobody was creating enough housing, so the goal is, okay, we got to start achieving. Now you and your local community start figuring out how to do that. So that's a big change that is gradually kicking in, that I think it's important, and it's going to be a big important opportunity, because then it means if we're zoning for more, we do need to advocate for how we want this growth in housing to be achieved. And things like different things that affect affordability, that afford transportation. We're going to have more openings. You know, when we're forced to make change, then we can, I think, have more say in which direction that change goes. So, lastly, I want to. Two more things. One is, Rick said I would talk about what I'm working on, so I will say that a little bit, which is a breakdown on, you know, oh, we're only creating half as much housing each year in California as we need to just in the gradual advance of population. Well, when you look even in more detail, I would say it's even more sobering, because we have two development models. One is publicly funded affordable housing, which is awesome in my opinion, great quality housing, but it takes a lot of money, and it's just a few drops in a big bucket we need to fill. So maybe we're building 20,000 units of publicly funded affordable housing across California each year. We're expanding that. We're passing, the legislature's putting more money into it. Some local jurisdictions are passing bonds to put more money into it. That's great. But again, you can see it's not going to dig us out of that millions of units of housing. That would literally be $1 trillion of tax money in California to build all the housing we need with public money. So it's a great piece, and in my view, should be concentrated on the folks that are hardest to help have great stable housing in any other way. But so very important, and we should be putting some more money into it, but it's not the full solution. And then we have development that tends to be higher price for sale housing. And again, I don't mean that as a full criticism. That's it's very difficult to create housing and very risky. And so when that is true, then capital that is willing to come in a free market way into creating that is the only capital willing to come in is seeking a decently high return, because it and sometimes is going to completely lose all of the money in projects that fail. So we have an industry that takes care of that part of the housing market, and we have almost nothing in between. And so in a really quick nutshell, what I've said about is to try to create another model for developing housing that is ultimately, I hope, to make lower risk. It's always risky starting up new things, but ultimately make lower risk and to make lower financial return. And I think there's huge amounts of capital that would love to create great real estate housing projects for folks and get a 5 or 6% return. There's philanthropic, not grant dollars, but there's a lot of foundations that invest money. They're happy to get a 3% return. So I've been raising and blending that capital, almost all new sources that have never put money into housing before, and using that to develop housing projects, typically that are mixed income, have some that are all permanent supportive housing to address chronic homelessness, but a lot that are mixed income rental projects, where we do some deed restricted affordable housing, other rental units that are in some way priced to cost. So we don't have to, in the long run, necessarily always be at the high market rate. We can have more affordability over time. And each project's a little bit different, what we can achieve. So that's what I'm looking to build in a way that could scale. So not just do one project that's charitable, but say, hey, this is housing our communities need to maintain a diverse workforce, to address homelessness, all of those things, and to have people be able to retire in the community that they've worked in, all of those things. And we need an industry that can do it. But a lot of our tools have atrophied. The lending to allow that kind of housing to be built, the planning, the fee structures, everything's against it. And so I'm working to build that. So I'd love to tell anyone more about that another time. But lastly, I want to loop back about transportation and particularly about parking. One of the hardest things to work on, barriers to creating housing, to creating rental housing like I'm trying to do, is parking and parking requirements. And of course, in reality today, a lot of projects, okay, we need some parking. But I completely agree that most of our regulations are not helping us in creating more affordable housing, or just housing that's somewhat less expensive, and they're not helping us plan for a great future with transportation and housing. So a couple quick examples. I have a 7-unit project, just really small, that's permanent supportive housing that hopefully will get approved very soon here in Santa Cruz. And the thorniest parts we had to work out with the city. This one's fortunately is not proving to be a really hard project to get approved, but the thorniest parts are all around parking. None of the people who live in this housing are going to own cars. Because it's in a location with a lot of services. It's for folks who've been in the hospital, who are homeless, they're recuperating, they're clean and sober at this point, and now with supportive services, they're going to be in this housing. This is specialty housing for folks who are really not able to have a vehicle. So, and it's right at a bus stop. I mean, it makes complete sense. And yet, the hardest part in getting through approval was getting the parking spaces that we're required to have approved. Okay, now we know how it's going to be great, useful parking for staff members of a nonprofit who work nearby. That's what we're going to use it for, but it was very hard. And there's a state law, crossing my fingers also, that's passed the legislature waiting for governor's signature that would say exactly this, that permanent supportive housing for folks who've been chronically homeless that has services attached to it, so some good caveats there, does not need resident parking. So again, the state legislature is hopefully going to save the day on this one, but getting it through local governments or trying to get every jurisdiction to fix that is essentially impossible. So that's just an example, but also just other mixed income rental housing projects where I feel like, oh, we've really got a really good rationale. We can share parking with this other use, that it's kind of like the picture Trick had with public parking garages, but there's a lot of businesses that have parking lots that are empty overnight. And it's like, oh, we're here with a whole bunch of parking available for what we need. Now, we need some parking during the day, but we work out, it can work, but we can't get through the jurisdiction process, the planning, the public works departments with that model. And it's very difficult. I just got a quote from a general contractor recently that said that, we wanted to explore, well, if we have to build, we don't think we need more parking here, but if we have to build more parking, could we build some of it underneath the building, not fully even submerged, not fully underground parking, but just so it had a way to do it. And it came back as 20% of the cost of the entire project. To do this modest amount of parking under the building. And there's just no way. We absolutely cannot pay for it. We would have to be in the category of selling high-end condos, would be the only way to do the project with that parking. And that we don't think we need. And we want to go overboard on bike infrastructure, on anything we can come up with, shared cars, anything we can do. So, and lastly, I'll conclude, that I believe that when it comes to, Rick specifically talked about downtown Santa Cruz and affordable housing projects in downtown Santa Cruz. Even anywhere in the entire Monterey Bay region, if there is one place in this entire region that we can build some housing without any parking at all, I believe it's downtown Santa Cruz. Now, it's not for everybody. Housing without any parking is not for everybody, but we have so much housing demand that I guarantee you, I know for sure, I know individuals, a growing number of minority of individuals, and then we got students, we got other folks, who don't have cars already, and if they could live near where they work in their modest paying job, they would love to do that if they could afford it without a car. And again, not everybody, but we can absolutely build some of our housing stock to be that. And if our opportunity is on some parking lots in downtown Santa Cruz to build affordable housing, great, publicly subsidized housing, I absolutely know. And you can legally preference, can't have a requirement that once somebody's in the housing, they don't own a car, but you can preference, and there's affordable housing in our region that does that, applications from folks who income qualify, who don't own a car. You can check it with the DMV, et cetera. So you can do some of that, and absolutely it would get get dozens of applications, if not hundreds, for every unit of housing from people who are happy to live in downtown Santa Cruz in affordable housing without a car. I believe that. Also, it's another thing the state is doing. There's new bills to further reduce the parking requirements when you're near transit, and our downtown bus stations in Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Scotts Valley, and a few other bus stops around the region that get particularly good service relative to others qualify on some new state laws to even further reduce the parking requirements. So some ways to get things passed around that are coming as well. And so I think, again, there's a bill waiting for signature, hope it happens, but if this latest bill passes, AB 1763, then it would give bigger density bonuses for all affordable projects and further lower parking requirement. And I think some of these downtown calculations of future parking need would, the details in those calculations would immediately change under state law, within 2 weeks of now, hopefully, if that law passes, so you could build affordable housing with less parking, which, again, I agree, in certain locations is what we should be doing anyway. I'm also really hopeful about downtown Watsonville. The city is underway with a new zoning plan for downtown Watsonville. I'm really excited about that. No details out yet that I've seen, but I'm excited about it because I think downtown Watsonville has a lot of opportunity. And when you're thinking about fresh new zoning around new housing density, a lot of opportunity to try to get it right. That could really be a place where, again, more housing, meeting more of the housing demand, trying to do affordable housing, mixed income housing in the mix, and you talk about pictures of parking garage. Watsonville, everybody actually agrees, has huge parking garage capacity already today. And that's pretty exciting because, again, it takes away some of the expense of building new housing with less parking, because there actually even is parking. And then also we need walkable downtown, et cetera. So I think the way to make Watsonville a vibrant downtown, which helps revenue to the city, et cetera, is get housing density there. So I'm excited about that. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussions in that community on how to do it. So that took me quite a while to get through.